Hi, I'm Gary Schuster. I'm a senior counsel with Jacobowitz and Gubits. I'm on the business team, and we're going to talk about business entities. If you want to start a business, there are several different kinds of entities for you to consider. The first kind of business entity is called a sole proprietorship. That means a single owner. It's not really an entity at all. It's really when a person just starts to do business. There is a legal requirement that if you're using a name that's not your name, you need to register that name with your county clerk. So if you decide to open a business called Wonderful Flowers, the county clerk wants to know who owns that business. The risk of having a sole proprietorship is that when you do business, if something happens, you are personally liable for all of the damages caused. If something explodes, if somebody trips on your property, if any number of things happen, your house, your car, your savings, everything is at risk and you could lose it all. That's why people use different kinds of business entities, but the simplest kind is the sole proprietorship. The second kind of business entity is a partnership. It's a little like a sole proprietorship, except there are two people or maybe more. When two or more people start to do business together, it's called a partnership. Just like with a sole proprietorship, the partners have full liability for everything that happens with the business. They could both, or all three partners could lose all of their houses and cars and savings if something goes wrong in the business. So once again, it's kind of a risky form of business. Another consideration in a partnership is that each partner is what they call jointly and severally liable to people it owes money to. So if the business owes money to a certain person, that person could sue any one partner and demand the whole amount from that one partner, and the one partner would have to pay it, and then they would have to go after their partners to be reimbursed. Joint and several liability means that any one person can be liable for the entire debt. Now there's another, just like with a sole proprietorship, if you're using an assumed name, you have to register your name with the county clerk. You have to file a piece of paper so the clerk knows who's running that business. The third kind of business entity is a corporation. Everybody's familiar with corporations. The reason corporations exist is to help owners preserve their assets. When you start a corporation, you invest a certain amount of money, and the corporation is a separate legal entity, and if it gets sued, if it owes people money, as a stockholder, as a shareholder, you can only lose your investment, and all of your other assets, your house, your car, your savings accounts, those are all isolated, they're protected. That's the major benefit in forming a corporation. People have other reasons to form corporations. They might want to raise money from other people. So you don't have enough money to start your business. You go to an investor. You say, give me some money and I'll give you some shares in the corporation. Yet another reason to incorporate is some people just want to look like they're a big company. They're just one person, but they want to have a fancy corporate name, so it's more of a marketing effect. But protection of assets is the primary reason people form corporations. Generally speaking, there's two kinds of corporations. We're all familiar with the large public corporations, the ones that are traded on the stock exchanges, that have millions of shares and maybe even millions of shareholders. Those are called public corporations. There's also smaller corporations with 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 shareholders that run smaller businesses. Those tend to be called close corporations because the ownership is closely held, closely controlled. That can be with a family or partners who decide to incorporate. Most of the businesses that we work with are close corporations. Just as with a partnership, when you have more than one shareholder, you really need to have a shareholders agreement to provide for what happens if a shareholder dies or becomes disabled, somebody wants to get out of the business, what happens if some other party comes along and wants to buy the corporation, who's going to work for the corporation, what kind of work they're going to do. There's all sorts of issues to be treated in a shareholder agreement. So it's very important to have a shareholder agreement and also to keep it up to date. As circumstances change, it may become obsolete and you find that it doesn't really help you when you need it. There's another distinction to be made among corporations which has to do with the way they're taxed. With a large corporation, a corporation will pay an income tax when it earns money. And then when it pays dividends to the shareholders will pay income tax on the dividends. So there's two levels of taxation, and in the tax code that's called a C corporation. But there's another kind of corporation called an S corporation. In those instances, the corporation is disregarded for tax purposes, and whatever money is earned by the corporation is immediately attributed to the shareholders. It goes directly onto their own personal income tax. They don't have the double layer of taxation. The corporation doesn't pay the tax, only the shareholders pay the tax on the corporate income. So that's the difference between the C corporations and the S corporations. A fourth kind of business entity, which is increasingly popular, is a limited liability company. It's kind of like a corporation because it gives insulation to the owners. Their personal assets, their house and their cars, they're not at risk. So in that way, it's like a corporation. In other ways, it's like a partnership with the way it's taxed and the flexibility that you have. That's the main benefit of a limited liability company. You have a great deal of flexibility in who invests money, who votes, who manages the company, how profits are distributed. Limited liability company is increasingly popular because it's much more flexible than the corporation, even though it gives the same protections of a corporation.